Do you know how many domestic violence cases end in tragedy each year? Have you ever wondered how a situation can escalate from years of silent suffering to a horrifying act of violence in mere moments? Takara Glenn, a devoted mother of 6, was finally taking steps to break free from the cycle of abuse that had haunted her for years.
Very sad situation. Neighbors say that woman expressed fear for her life in the past.
She had found the courage to speak to an NCIS agent about the horrors she endured behind closed doors. But before she could escape, before she could start anew, her life was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable, while she held her infant child in her arms. But how could this have happened? Why wasn't she protected? And what pushed her husband, Greg, to commit such a monstrous act in broad daylight? Join us as we are going to explore the tragic case of Takara Glenn, a story of fear, neglect, and a system that failed her when she needed it most. It was a quiet afternoon in Humble, Texas, when 34-year-old Takara Hightower sat down with 2 Naval Criminal Investigative Service (NCIS) agents inside her home. She was there to discuss a domestic violence complaint she had filed against her husband, Gregory Hightower. Her accusations were serious, but she hoped that, by speaking with the investigators, she could finally bring an end to the abuse she had endured. Gregory, a 37-year-old Navy senior chief recruiter, was also present in the house at the time. What happened next was nothing short of horrifying.
We just got to the scene, just finished talking to Sheriff Gonzalez about the latest developments. He confirms 1 woman is dead here. Her husband was actually the one accused of shooting and killing her, then leaving the scene.
Moments later, gunfire erupted. When the chaos ended, Takara lay dead, still clutching her baby in her arms. To the outside world, Takara and Greg appeared to have the ideal marriage. They had been together for 15 years, building a life in Texas while Greg dedicated nearly 2 decades to his military career. Takara, described by friends as glamorous, intelligent, and fiercely devoted to her children, had always seemed like a woman who had it all. But behind the closed doors of their home, a much darker story was unfolding. Takara's friends and family knew her as a woman who deeply loved her children and was willing to do whatever it took to give them a happy and secure life. However, even the strongest love couldn't protect her from the escalating violence within her marriage. Over time, Greg's temper worsened, and the once loving husband became someone Takara feared. Domestic abuse is a silent epidemic that affects millions of households, and Takara's situation was no different.
But recently struggled with domestic violence. 2 of those children were here at the time, investigators say, but they were not hurt.
It's crazy. Never would have expected it. Nice family.
Neighbors in the Balmoral community are stunned. Deputies say a man shot and killed his wife.
In August 2019, after years of suffering in silence, she finally decided to report Greg to the authorities. She accused him of hitting her, hoping that law enforcement would intervene. At first, the police took the report seriously, launching an investigation into the Hightower household. But then Greg fought back in a way Takara hadn't expected. He filed a counter-complaint, alleging that she had been the aggressor. Suddenly, the police saw the situation differently. Rather than a victim seeking help, Takara was now viewed as just another party in a messy domestic dispute. With conflicting accounts and no solid evidence, the case was dismissed. No charges were filed against either of them. For Takara, this was devastating. She had taken the terrifying first step of reaching out for help, only to have the system fail her. Worse, the lack of consequences only emboldened Greg. He knew now that he could get away with it. The abuse didn't stop. It escalated. Between 2019 and 2022, things inside the Hightower home deteriorated. The arguments became more frequent. The violence became more brutal. But despite everything, Takara stayed. Whether it was out of love, fear, or the hope that Greg might change, she endured it all for 3 more years. But by September 2022, she had reached her breaking point. Something inside her shifted. She could no longer keep quiet. Her children were growing up in a house filled with fear, and she could no longer pretend everything was okay. She had to take action. So once again, she reached out to the authorities. But this time, she went straight to the military. Unlike the local police, NCIS took Takara's claims seriously. Given Greg's position in the Navy, they understood that if her accusations were true, they were dealing with more than just a personal dispute. This was a criminal matter that could impact the integrity of the military itself. They arranged to meet with Takara at her home on September 22, 2022, to gather more information. For Takara, this meeting was an act of courage. She knew what speaking out against Greg could mean. It could destroy his career, their marriage, and everything they had built together. But she also knew it was the only way to protect herself and her children. As she sat with the agents, detailing the years of abuse she had endured, Greg was in the house listening. The walls were thin, and the weight of her words filled the air. It was at that moment that something inside him snapped. Greg stormed into the room. Whether it was premeditated or a crime of passion, no one will ever truly know. What is known is that he pulled out a gun and began firing. Takara, holding her baby in her arms, had no chance to escape. She was shot and killed instantly. One of the NCIS agents was also critically injured in the attack. By the time authorities arrived, the damage was done. A mother was dead, a baby left orphaned, and a man who was once a decorated Navy officer was now a murderer. As the news of Takara's murder spread, friends, family, and neighbors were left in shock. Many couldn't believe that Greg, respected, disciplined, and well-liked, was capable of such brutality. On the afternoon of September 22, 2022, Takara Glenn sat in her home in Humble, Texas, being interviewed by a Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS agent. The agent was specially trained in handling domestic violence cases and knew how to approach the subject with care. Takara answered the questions openly, detailing the abuse she had endured over the years at the hands of her husband, Gregory Hightower, a Navy recruiter. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this time, she would finally be heard. The NCIS agent briefly stepped out to make some phone calls, leaving Takara alone in the house. That's when Greg stormed in, his face twisted with rage. He had discovered that his wife was speaking to authorities, and he was furious. Takara, terrified, tried to calm him down, but he wasn't there to listen.
Again, all of this is very preliminary. They have those two scenes right now. The NCIS investigator was taken to the hospital. He was in serious condition, but as of 10 minutes ago, when I talked to the sheriff on camera, he confirms that person, that man, is now in fair condition, so he is doing better. Again, one person dead, one person at the hospital, and that suspect has been killed, according to the sheriff's office. I want to take you to the sound from the sheriff. Again, we just talked to him about how the situation unfolded. This is what we know at this hour.
Before she could react, he pulled out a concealed handgun and fired at her. The bullet struck her instantly, and she collapsed to the floor, lifeless. But the most horrifying part? At the time of the shooting, she had been holding their baby in her arms. Neighbors heard the gunfire and immediately called 911. One security camera from across the street captured the next horrific moments. As Greg fled the house, he encountered the NCIS agent returning to the scene. Without hesitation, Greg opened fire on the agent, who was struck but managed to return fire. The agent collapsed from his wound, while Greg, also hit, staggered toward his car and sped away. Takara's body lay on the floor, still clutching her crying infant, as police officers arrived at the scene. Miraculously, the child was unharmed. The NCIS agent, though wounded, was rushed to the hospital in stable condition. But for Takara, it was too late. As the reality of the brutal murder set in, law enforcement launched a statewide manhunt. They feared that Greg, a trained military officer, would be difficult to track down. The expectation was that he would flee far from the crime scene, attempting to avoid capture for as long as possible. But to their surprise, he hadn't gone far at all. Less than 25 miles from the crime scene, Greg was found sitting in his car outside his mother's house. It was she who had alerted the police, worried about what her son might do next. Officers surrounded the vehicle, blocking any escape routes. Greg was out of options, but the situation took an even darker turn when they ordered him to surrender. As the police negotiated with Greg, hoping he would turn himself in peacefully, he made a final, chilling decision. Rather than face justice, Greg raised his weapon one last time, this time turning it on himself. A single gunshot echoed through the quiet suburban street. When officers rushed in, they found Greg slumped over, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. With that, the tragic saga of Takara Glenn and Gregory Hightower came to an end. A family was shattered, 6 children left without their parents. But the questions remained. How had this been allowed to happen? How had Takara's pleas for help gone unanswered for so long? The authorities thought that maybe it had been a pure moment of anger and madness that had driven Greg to shoot his wife in such close proximity to their child and then fire at NCIS officers. But Greg didn't respond. Despite police pleading with him and asking him to surrender peacefully, he remained eerily still and silent in his parked car. Officers even tried reasoning with him, reminding him that he needed medical attention. After all, he had been badly injured during the initial shootout, and if left untreated, the wound could prove fatal. Yet Greg remained unresponsive, seemingly lost in his own world. "I was just watching from my window when I heard them shouting," a witness later recalled. One of the officers was yelling, "Put it down! Put it down!" And then boom, 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 it was over. Greg had suddenly leapt out of his car, gun in hand, and opened fire on the surrounding officers. Blood already soaked his clothes, and his movements seemed erratic, almost frenzied. Perhaps he believed he could fight his way out of the situation, or maybe he knew this was the end and wanted to go out in a blaze of violence.
My heart is torn into pieces about my baby sister, my bestest friend, my first baby before I ever even thought about having a baby, is gone.
Whatever his reasoning, law enforcement had no choice but to return fire. Cutting him down in the street, he was killed instantly. The entire confrontation had escalated in seconds, leaving onlookers shocked. One neighbor who had spoken to Takara the night before was particularly shaken. "She told me she was scared for her life," and he said, "I even helped her lock up the house and make sure everything was secure. And now, she's gone." The chaos had ended, but the questions were only beginning. Why had Greg reacted so violently? Where had he gotten the gun? And most importantly, could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy from happening in the first place? Many of these answers died with Takara and Greg, but that didn't stop authorities from searching for the truth. A full-scale investigation was launched, and every detail of the case was scrutinized. The biggest question was why the system had failed Takara so many times. She had first reported Greg's abuse in 2019, but the case had been dropped, allowing him to continue his reign of terror unchecked. If action had been taken then, could her death, and the deaths of so many others in similar situations, have been prevented? For Takara's grieving family, justice and accountability became their main focus. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why law enforcement had ignored her cries for help and why it had taken such a horrific event for anyone to truly pay attention. But the biggest victims in all of this were Takara and Greg's children. In an instant, they had lost both their mother and father. Now they faced a future without the parents who were supposed to protect them. In a heartbreaking Facebook post, Takara's sister poured out her grief. "My heart is torn into pieces. My baby sister, my best friend, the one I helped raise before I even had kids of my own, she's gone. How do we move on from this?" She went on to describe how the family was rallying together to care for Takara's children, ensuring they were surrounded by love and support. They refused to let Takara's memory fade. They would keep her alive through stories, through laughter, and through the unwavering bond of family. Takara's case is just one of thousands. Domestic violence is an epidemic, not just in the United States, but around the world. Too many people suffer in silence, their cries for help ignored until it's too late. In short, the tragic case of Takara Glenn, a Texas mother killed while holding her baby, is a heartbreaking example of the devastating consequences of senseless violence. Her death not only robbed a child of their mother, but also left a family and community grieving an irreplaceable loss. The sheer cruelty of the act, with Takara desperately protecting her infant in her final moments, underscores the devastating reality of gun violence and domestic-related crimes. As the investigation unfolds, law enforcement and prosecutors will work to ensure justice is served. The legal process may bring answers, but no conviction or sentence can ever truly compensate for the life lost. What remains is a profound void in the lives of those who love Takara, especially her young child, who will grow up without her mother's love and guidance. This case is a stark reminder of the importance of addressing domestic violence, ensuring better protection for at-risk individuals, and holding perpetrators accountable. It also highlights the need for stronger community support systems that can intervene before tragedies occur. As her family and friends seek justice, the public must also reflect on ways to prevent such senseless acts in the future. Takara Glenn's story is one of love, sacrifice, and unimaginable loss. As her memory lives on, may it serve as a call to action to protect the vulnerable and ensure that justice prevails for victims of violent crime. That's all for this video. We hope you have found this video informative and interesting. What do you think about this case? Why do you think Greg reacted so violently to Takara speaking with the NCIS officer? And do you believe law enforcement could have done more to prevent this tragedy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon for more interesting videos like this. Thank you for watching our video.